I'm Mrs. Alseri, and in this video I'm going to give you an introduction to using watercolor paints. Some basic supplies that I'm using today are a watercolor palette, a round paintbrush with really soft bristles, some paper. I like to use Strathmore watercolor paper. It comes in a pack like this. You can get it at Michael's. And if you don't have watercolor paper, you can either use your sketchbook or you can use a piece of blank computer paper. I also always have paper towel by and a cup for water. And if you do have a color wheel, this is gonna really come in handy. You might need to download one and print one off the internet if you'd like. So first I want to talk about the type of paints that you're using. Right now I'm using these Da Vinci brand pan watercolors. They come in quite a few different colors, and it's nice because there's a chart up here to tell you the name of the color. And if you don't have something like that, you can get watercolors at Meijer. They sell a brand called Reeves, which is pretty good for using in school. You can get them at Michael's. There's a couple different brands. Crayola makes a pretty good watercolor too that I use in the classroom. So for today's video, I'm just going to use a pan watercolor. And in this series, I have created another video that talks about many different kinds of watercolors and why you might choose one over another. So today I'm just going to use the pan because I have all the colors here right in front of me. And it's really easy because you just dip your paintbrush in water, grab some paint, and you can get started. Okay, so I have my workstation set up with my paper long ways and my watercolor palette right in front of me. And then the paintbrush that I'm using, this is just a Crayola round brush. You can also find these many places. I think they have it at Meijer and also Michael's. And my cup of water is over here. I'm a lefty, so I have to be careful with where I put my water or I'll spill it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just dip my paintbrush in the water. This is always how you're going to start because you need a wet paintbrush. And I want you to just practice grabbing a little bit of paint very gently. The first time you use a color, when it's dry, you're gonna need to saturate it. So I just did a couple passes, very light. I'm gonna put it directly on my dry paper and just do a little area of that yellow. Just paint it right on there. This is gonna let me know what the intensity is of the color, depending on how much water and how much paint I wanna use. If I think it's too light, I dip my paintbrush back in the water, do a couple more passes of the same color, and I can add to it right on top. It gets a little bit brighter. If it's too dark, there's a couple things I can do. While it's still wet, you can take your paper towel and you can dab it. And yellow is already a really light color, so you can just barely see it, but that's kind of a nice color. Or sometimes, let's try that again. You can even use your paintbrush to mop up some of the extra paint. So there's another pretty bright yellow. Rinse my brush. Let's see what happens if I just put some, kind of grab it with the bristles. See how you can see it's back on the brush, dip it in the water. You can do it a second time. It's a really faint difference, but it does help sometimes if you're working with a lot of different colors next to each other. Okay, so I'm gonna just make a row of some of the main colors on the color wheel. Yellow, red, orange, blue, green, and purple. My palette doesn't have an orange, so I'm just gonna make it, but let's see what we got so far. So if your palette looks different than mine, just experiment, maybe grab one of each color, see what it looks like. Just grabbing some water, making 2 or 3 passes on the paint, getting that on the paper. I'm gonna have to make my blobs a little smaller so I can fit all of them. My orange this is actually brown, but it's pretty orangey. Just gonna grab 2 more, I think I can fit them. There's the blue. And every time I switch colors, you have to rinse your paintbrush or you'll make your colors very muddy. If you're sharing them with someone, they will really appreciate that you take your time and take care of your paints. Otherwise, you're not gonna be happy with a yellow paint if there's a bunch of brown and blue and other colors in there. Keep it nice and clean. Okay, so this is my assorted colors. Now what I'm going to start doing is kind of experimenting with the amounts of water and the amounts of paint that I use. So I'm gonna try something called wet on wet. I'm gonna put a little bit of paint down, and then I'm gonna grab my first color, which for me was yellow, and I'm gonna put some paint right on there, and then I'm gonna compare it to my other yellows and see if I can tell a difference. So this was wiped off, this is wet on dry paper, and this is wet paint on wet paper. To me, this is easier to blend when you do the wet on wet because you can really push the color across the paper. So I'm gonna try it with a couple other colors. Again, I'm using just a couple of passes across the pan of paint. This is that pink color. Let's try it with this bright red. Oops, I forgot to get my paper wet. And I know a lot of watercolor artists work in different ways when using wet on wet. Sometimes they like to wet an entire area. Sometimes they'll just do a little bit at a time. So it really depends on what you're painting. Today we're just practicing. Let's grab some of this, just a little bit. Oh wow. You can hear my coffee going in the background. It smells like it's ready. It smells delicious. All right, there's a little wet. And since I have the room, I might as well keep going and do one of each. I can already tell that wet on wet is harder to control. It has looser edges than the wet on dry. Hopefully you notice that too when you do this. A little bit of water. Oh yeah, that blue is really intense. Last one, I'm gonna do this green. Oh, I barely had to touch it. The water just really grabbed that off my brush. Okay. So before we move on to the last thing I want to show you in this video, I forgot to mention that having a palette or a plastic lid nearby to mix colors on with watercolor is going to be really helpful. A lot of people like to use the top of their tray that their watercolors come in. So for mine it would be this part, but actually that can mix up all your colors when you close the lid. So I like to use like an old Thai food tray. I collect these plastic ones and I just clean them off every time I'm done, and you can recycle them when you're all finished. But these are nice because you can add different amounts of water to a color and you can see how the different amounts of water affect the brightness or the saturation of a color. So a color straight from the palette, not mixing it, is called the hue. It's the brightest form of a color. And when you start adding a little bit more of water to it, then it's going to become less and less saturated, and your color is going to look lighter because you're letting more white of the paper show through. So the last part of this lesson is where I am going to show you how to make a value scale with one color. So this would be a good time to use your plastic tray and start experimenting by choosing a color, using just a little bit of water. I'm going to start with this green. And then add a little bit of water at a time. See if you can come up with at least 4 or 5 different values of that green. It will be harder to see on your mixing tray than on your paper. So once you think you got the hang of this, grabbing some paint, putting it down, adding more and more water as you go, then you can start to make your value scale. Let me just do a couple more. So even though I can't really see how light or dark the green is, I know that I'm putting more and more water as I go. I'm just dipping my paintbrush back in the water, mixing it in, dipping it, mixing it in. I can tell that's got a lot of water in it. All right, let's try it. Let's see what happens. So I'm gonna do my darkest first. I'm gonna just grab it right from the tray. And I'm gonna start on the left side. And I'm just gonna paint a little square or a little circle, blob. And then I'm gonna put a second coat on top and make it a little bit darker. I told you I'm a lefty. I tend to be clumsy and spill things, so I have to watch out. Okay, next one. I'm gonna rinse my paintbrush before I keep grabbing more color. That'll also help making your colors lighter and lighter as you go. So I'll know that I'm doing this right if I can see a difference between each value that I'm making, which I can definitely tell this is very light. So I'm gonna add a second layer of that and see if it darkens it a tiny bit. And I can always go back and make that darker. So I'm gonna just keep moving on. A lot of times it's all about adjusting the amounts until you get it right. It's practice. Let's put a little more water on that. Can you see the difference? It's getting there. Let's try this one. I know I added a lot of water to it. And it looks very similar to the one before it. So add some more water. You can even dab your brush on the paper towel and then lift some color out with your brush. That helps a lot. Let's see if I can fit a 5th one on there. Which this one's gonna have mostly water, a very small amount of paint. So I'm gonna put some paint on my tray. That's already way too much. Rinse my brush really well. And I'm gonna add some water maybe 4 or 5 times. Stir it up, stir it up. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And it should just have a very faint amount of color. Let's see. Not too much different from the one before, so what can I do? I can either wipe my brush, mop some up, or I can take my paper towel and just lift out a little bit, just by dabbing it if you want. And there you have it, a value scale with 5 different values of green. All right, guys, I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for joining me. Please look for my next video in this series where I talk more about watercolor materials. It's gonna be fun. Bye.